If that's okay,
Perfect.
thank you very much. Thank you.
So the topic, as was mentioned by my good friend, Dr. Ahmed Khulif, is about authorship and acknowledgement. And I'd like to thank Dr. Mahmoud twice, actually. First, before he invited me to talk to you about this topic. And second, because he chose to me this title, which introduced me to something, a whole new ball game that I didn't know a lot about. So I'd like to remind you that once we join academia, most of us are pushed to research. And we are pushed to research for different reasons. We have different motives as we go through the ladder of positionship. And we have different motives when we are young, and we have different motives when we get older until we start to research in peace. And unfortunately, at the core of scientific production is not research. At the core of scientific production for most of the individuals is authorship, because we are all running after publications. And in fact, we have all been told that you need to publish or perish. And then you need to publish in specific journals with good impact factor. And some of us becomes addict to publication. And in fact, I kind of wonder, how can somebody publish every week? Once you have a name that gets on a publication every week, you have to put some kind of a question mark about the validity of this publication. But most of us are interested in publication, definitely. As individuals, we cannot be promoted academically without having our name stuck on some kind of a paper somewhere. And institutions are particularly interested in publications as well. So authorship is at the core of scientific production. Unfortunately, authors are much more than inventors. And unfortunately, not all authors write to make an impact. Most authors write to have their names on a piece of paper. And that's why authorship has been the core of many, many bodies in the world. There are two large groups of bodies that control authorship. The global bodies like the International Congress of Medical Journal Editors and COPE, which is the Congress of Publishing Ethics. These are global recommendations. They are global bodies that have actually tried to standardize authorship. And then there are very reputable institutions like the Harvard Medical School and the National Institute of Health. And we're going to talk about all these bodies. But most of the time, the aim of any standardization and guidelines for authorship has always been about the same, with very few differences. And it's all about the legitimacy of publications. So what is authorship? I brought to you first the Harvard Medical School because it is very familiar to our environment. And authorship has been defined by the Harvard Medical School Ombuds Office as an explicit declaration of assignment of responsibility. And it is a giving to credit, and it all goes around this word. It's an intellectual work. So authorship is mainly about a creation, an intellectual creation. And that's why there has been an aberration in authorship, which we are all familiar with. And in fact, many of us have gone through the experience of being asked to put names on their paper without actually having somebody contributing to the work. And in fact, it is not always coercion, because sometimes junior investigators simply like to put on their work the names of senior contributors and not really contributors, simply because they want to improve the credibility and they want to increase the chance of publication. And the senior investigators have been brought up taking a legacy from the more senior investigators that it is their own right. Once I'm a senior investigator and I've got a unit, and if there is any work or research work which is going from that unit, it makes perfect sense that my name has to be put in the authorship list. But we do have different authorship. We do have authors that we call honorary, guest, or gift authors. These are authors that have their names on the work without having any contributions to the work. There are ghost authors, which have done a lot of work, but unfortunately, they couldn't have their names on the publication. There are different reasons for that, especially when there's a company funding a research and the institution publishing the work doesn't want to link its name to the company. And then obviously there are planted authors that get their names put on a publication without their even knowledge or consent. And relinquished authors, these are the ones that do the work, and for some odd personal reason, they chose not to have the names on the work, and prepared to replace that with another author. And all these different authorship are mentioned in the standards and in the guidelines to be condemned. So none of them is considered ethical. So if you put your name on a work that you didn't contribute to, this is a highly unethical activity. And we all know that the scope of authorship is very broad. It's an intellectual activity, and any kind of intellectual creation deserves creditorship. It deserves accountability, it deserves responsibility, and that brings us to the concept of contributorship. And I'd like you to remember that name because this will be the end of our talk. So what does the Harvard Medical School authorship guidelines tell us? It tells us that for you to gain the right and legitimacy of being mentioned as an author, your contribution to the work has to be substantial, it has to be direct and intellectual. And I think that the key to the problem with authorship in the world is that word, substantial. Why is that? Because what is in fact substantial? Substantial is something that you cannot measure. Perhaps as a senior author, the fact that I put my name on a piece of work is substantial. Perhaps the fact that I simply suggest a title makes me a substantial contributor, but what is substantial? What the authorship guidelines elaborated on is that they told us that the research should have a contribution in the conception, which is the idea of the work, the design, and the data manipulation, whether how you acquire the data, how you analyze it, how you give the interpretation to the data. All these are important contributions you have to share with. But if your contribution was providing patients to be studied, this doesn't give you the right to become an author. If you're providing technical service, if you manage to bring the funding, if you give just general supervision to a research group, all this does not state you as an author. Any such activities give you the right to become acknowledged, nothing more than acknowledgement, at least in the most recent up-to-date authorship. So most of the authorship rights go around your contribution to the manuscript. And even if your contribution to the technical part of the research has been highly specialized, you have to have shared in the manuscript, at least reviewing the draft. And most authors and all authors have to give the approval for the final version. They must stamp the ready to get published stamp. And this has to be documented by the primary author and put in a record within the institution or the department from which the work has emanated. So this brings us to the order of authorship. Most of us now have papers with multiple authors. They can be multidisciplinary, they can be interdisciplinary. And there have been lots of debate about what is the best way of doing it. In fact, there is no generally agreed upon meaning. And in the past, we have all passed through the era while the senior author had to have his name first. But nowadays, most of the people would advise you to put the first leading writer is probably the younger writer, the one who wrote the draft, who worked more on the manuscript, and the most experienced contributor will have the last name. And the rest of the order has to be decided among the different authors. And Reisenberg has suggested in the Journal of the American Medical Association that there are three important positions among authors. The first that we mentioned before, the last author, which should be mostly the most senior and experienced author, and the corresponding author. Mostly the corresponding author is going to be the first author. But the last author sometimes can take over the role of a corresponding author when he has done most of the work, when he has shared most in the writing of the manuscript, and especially when the junior contributor or researcher is not up to writing the whole manuscript. So what happened to the rest of the authors? They don't stand up in sheep, but the rest of the authors have to be put according to what we call the relative overall contribution. Again, this brings me to this word of contribution. Contribution is an important concept about who gets his name to be put as an author. And all the guidelines have to be discussed in groups among the research team. Any dispute will have to be solved immediately, and the components of the guidelines have to be taught among any research ethics course. And obviously, all these are periodically changed and updated. So what is this issue about attribution authorship? Why is it so important to assess the attribution of the authorship? I think the key for that is the word shouldering. Once you've been attributed an authorship, you're shouldering the responsibility of that authorship. And that brings us to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. One of the very important international bodies have stated that all the components of guidelines have to be added together. So not only you should have a substantial contribution to the research itself in terms of conception, design, and data management, but you add to that a contribution very substantial to the drafts and the manuscripts, and you add to that the final approval of version to be published, and you must agree to accountability. So what is about this accountability? Why are people so much talking about authors' accountability? What does it mean, and why is it that important? What it means is that you are responsible for all aspects of the work. It means that you have to answer any question about the accuracy and integrity of your work. You want to make sure that your work is accurate and it has been honest. And it means that you have a responsibility to help and collaborate with any investigation in order to resolve any question about the accuracy and integrity of your work. So why all the fuss? Why all the hassle? Let me bring you to a little story. I don't know how many of you is familiar with the story of the rise and fall of Hwang Woo-suk. Hwang Woo-suk is a South Korean veterinary, a very reputable scientist, a professor in Seoul University, who was named the Pride of Korea. And that was in 2004, 2005. The gentleman you see beside him over here with the gray hair is Professor Gerald Schatten from Pittsburgh. And that pleasant dog is Sooty. This is a dog that was cloned. This dog was cloned a few years after Dolly. We are all familiar with the sheep Dolly. And Hwang Woo-suk got his fame because in 2004 and 2005, he published 2 papers for the first time in the world. He managed to clone human embryonic stem cells for the first time in history. And everything was doing brilliant until within a few years after the second publication in 2005, a publication in Nature, which is another, which is a journal that was answering the original journal where Hwang Woo-suk put his publication, which was in Science journal. Nature stated that there was some ethical issue about the work of Hwang Woo-suk. Initially, Hwang Woo-suk denied it, but in due time, it was obvious that his team had doctored the data. Doctored the data means that the data in the research were false, they were fraud, they were cooked. And once this was told, immediately Gerald Schatten, his contributor for many, many years from Pittsburgh, sent to Science journal asking to have his name removed from the authorship of this paper. What did Science journal say? No single author having declared at the time of submission his full and complete confidence in the contents of a paper can retract his name unilaterally after publication. In fact, a few months after refusing to withdraw Gerald Schatten's name, the whole paper was retracted with shame following every member of the authorship team. And in fact, Hwang Woo-suk had to resign, and he was subject to criminal prosecution for which he was sentenced for 2.5 years of stopped sentence of 2.5 years imprisonment. So this is really very, very serious. Authorship comes with accountability. And when you look in the literature, you will find that authorship misbehavior has been numerous in the world. A researcher's perception of ethical authorship distribution in collaborative research teamwork has been published, and reviewing all publications between 2011 to 2015 with more than 8,000 authors responding, with more than 1,400 authors giving a full account for open-ended questions, gave their impression and opinion about how authorship misbehavior is going on. And this has been divided into 4 groups. There has been a huge amount of disagreements among authors. A lot of the authors consider the behavior of their colleagues questionable with a question mark. Rank and needs are 2 potent factors that influence externally the validity of research, something that is not supposed to happen in scientific research. And all these specific values that all responders were longing for in terms of transparency, justice, fairness, or equality has been deemed not to be always available. What I'd like to point your attention to is how this paper was authored. The initial first author was Elise Smith. You look initially under the title that Elise Smith was mentioned as the sole author et al., and the full author details will come at the end of the article. When you look at the author contributions, you can find a detailed description of the contributions of each author. So Elise Smith started the research, as she mentions, within the paper, declared for the readers, in collaboration with BWG, which is Bryn Williams Jones, and ZM, who is Zubin Master, under the supervision of DBR David Resnick, who is the most senior author, written at the end of the authorship. Any other contribution has been mentioned in acknowledgement. Specific contributions are detailed within the paragraph of author contributions. What is interesting is that the qualitative data analysis was conducted initially not by the primary author Elise Smith, but by Katie Codle, by ED, and Elise Smith is the third mention according to her proportion of contribution. This is how author contributions are being mentioned and detailed. And that brings us to the concept of contribution. So how to spot authorship problems? COPE, which is a Committee of Publishing Ethics, have given us lots of examples on that, like lack of publication permission, systematic manipulation, withdrawal of republications, failure of giving the credit to other authors, and there is a good, interesting algorithm about how to follow that. There are specific symptoms that one can look for, which act like red flags. Once, as an editor or a publishing house, you detect them, you start to inquire about the integrity of authorship in that paper. So if you find a language quality in the manuscript which does not match that of the cover letter, that drives your attention to perhaps there is something about the authorship. If you find questionable roles of contributors, you have to investigate. What if you have corresponding authors that do not respond to the reviewer's comments? So you can follow lots of signs that can drive your attention to perhaps a misbehavior on the authorship side. Now that brings us to this new concept, which is going on in the world. Over the past few years, there has been a lot of drive to go from authorship to contributorship. Nowadays, it is not about who puts his name on the paper, but it's about who does what within the research. And there are specifically now 2 particular terms, guarantorship and corresponding author. So the corresponding author is probably going to be the first author, the primary author, the guy who has particularly took on his shoulder the writing of the manuscript. The guarantorship is probably going to be the senior reviewer, the senior investigator, the guy who will act as a guarantee. This is why he's called the guarantor. So guarantorship is given by the most senior researcher investigator, the one whose unit is responsible for the scientific work. And all authorship are going to be included under the term contributorship. So what is contributorship? Recently, the Consortia for Advancing Standard in Research Administration Information, what we call the CASRAI, has been actually guested by the Harvard Medical School, and they produce what we call the contributor role taxonomy, credit. And credit is written like this, with a capital CR in the beginning and a capital T at the end, to point to contributor role taxonomy. And taxonomy means classification. And they classified the different types of contribution. There's a definition for each type of contribution with 14 terms, starting from conceptualization, validation, formal analysis, going to data curation, two types of contributions in writing, one who writes the original draft, one who reviews them, supervision, funding, acquisition. And each name has to be assigned to a specific contribution. And you will need to click on your author contribution. So the publishing house will give you a choice, and you will click at one of the 14 choices with an extra one, which is optional if you want to write something more in descriptive terms. And this is how you declare your contribution to the work. But why is this more important now? Simply having a few names at the beginning of a manuscript that describe the research doesn't tell you who did what. In fact, with credit, now all these honorary, guest, ghost, gifted authors will not exist, because each one will have to declare exactly, specifically, and to the point, what was his contribution to the work. People who read the scientific research will know who to contact for a specific contribution. If you shared in the work with perhaps some kind of a lab investigation, and you're the best lab technician in the research, then whoever wants a lab technician that contributed to the research, they will contact you personally. It will facilitate cross-disciplinary collaborations. Each contribution will have its own place, well declared, which will help significantly meta-science and meta-analysis. And this is why McNutt and colleagues, McNutt is the president of the National Academy of Science, and has recently, with different other authors and editors, changed the ICMJE criteria, which has been updated in 2018. And the difference between the criteria of McNutt and colleague and that by the ICMJE is that there is an or instead of an and in front of have drafted the work. So the writing of the manuscript is not anymore the essential component of the publication. The writing of the manuscript is simply a way to display the scientific research and the contribution of every individual within the team. And there have been lots of adopters for credit recently. In fact, if you go on the website of CASRAI, you will find more than 120 reputable publishing houses, which are now shifting from authorship to contributorship, among which, just to name a few, the British Medical Journal, the Journal of Bone and Joint, Lippincott, Williams and Wilkins publishing houses, SAE, SABE, Slack, Springer, Walters Kluwer, Oxford University Press, and most interestingly, PLOS. For those of you who don't know what PLOS is, this is the future of publication, Public Library of Science. This is the one non-profit organization which has started to push that publication should be for free, open access to everybody, and not only for paid subscription journals. So the future is going to be with credit from CASRAI and with PLOS, or Public Library of Science. So what is the take-home message? Research, unfortunately, is not synonymous with authorship. The author simply, in the past, has been the one who writes the manuscript. But in fact, research can better be understood by the concept of contributorship. We still stick to the current guidelines of authorship. They have to be substantial. They have to involve the research itself in terms of the conception, design, data management. At least being familiar with the manuscript is required, and the concept of accountability is at the core of authorship. But the way forward is on the road to contributorship. Now, I suggest to you, if you're interested in following this further on, COPE will do a seminar recently on Webline in the 10th and the 24th of February on a workshop of authorship. I think this is a topic that most of us don't understand all its ins and outs, and we need to enhance our understanding of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.